Hi listeners, welcome to this new episode of my podcast, A Digital Tomorrow. Today, I'm joined by Tunyathon Koonprasert from the Bank of Thailand. Teo is working as a senior specialist on the digital currency team. Welcome to my show, Teo.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's actually my pleasure to be able to host you today. We're going to talk about very interesting things about Thailand, CBDCs, but well, I think I should start like from the very beginning by asking you two different things. One about you and the other about the Bank of Thailand. The first one is more about you. I would like to ask you about your personal journey. What made you decide to end up working in, well, in a central bank, digital currencies, etc. And then on a second level, when it comes to your employer, I wanted to ask you if you could please let our listeners know a bit more about the Bank of Thailand, like when it was created, what are its goals, etc.
Yeah, sure. Of course, I'd be happy to. So thank you very much again for having me. My name is Teo. My full name is Tunyathon Koonprasert. I'd rather go by Teo just because it's easier for everyone to pronounce. I am a senior specialist on the Bank of Thailand's digital currency team. So on this team, I do central bank digital currencies. And before this, so I've been on the team for about a year and a half now. And before this, I was also at the Bank of Thailand, where I worked on foreign exchange regulations. Given that Thailand is still a country with capital controls and foreign exchange regulations in place, my role was to sort of analyze the holdings of Thai baht by non-residents in non-resident financial institutions. So that was largely my background, and I became interested in fintech and fintech developments, and also in the crypto assets and digital currency space. I would say maybe two years ago, while I was at grad school at the Harvard Kennedy School, I had the opportunity to do an internship with a small Tunisian startup in Tunis, Tunisia, and they were building what is pretty much the PayPal or the Venmo of Tunisia. So I became interested in fintech since then, and then I went on to do a second internship during my graduate studies at the Alliance for Financial Inclusion in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And this was where I worked with other central banks and financial regulators from around the world to sort of help them prepare themselves in establishing an ecosystem that would be supportive of fintech and new financial technology and developments in emerging countries. So that's pretty much my background. And now I'm here on the digital currency team working on CBDCs. Oh, right. And your second question regarding, what is the Bank of Thailand, right? So the Bank of Thailand is Thailand's central bank. It was set up in 1942, so exactly 80 years ago, actually. This is our 80th anniversary. And the roles of the Bank of Thailand are pretty much, just like under any other central bank. We print, distribute banknotes, conduct monetary policy, manage foreign reserves. We also regulate and supervise financial institutions and payment systems. But I guess one thing that is different about the Bank of Thailand, maybe compared to more advanced economies, is that, like I said before, Thailand is a country with capital control still in place. So we oversee these regulations as well.
Well, thank you very much for sharing both about your personal journey and about the Bank of Thailand. When it comes to your personal journey, I think it's very interesting to see that you started by working more on financial inclusion related projects. And I say it is interesting for me because I'm as well working at the intersection between digital currencies and financial inclusion. For example, I'm co-leading both the financial inclusion and blockchain working group at the Global Impact FinTech Forum, which is a nation-based think tank. So I think it's interesting to see that you started in that area, because I think that CBDCs, for example, as we're going to discuss later, may have, and to me will have, a huge impact when it comes to promoting financial inclusion. So I think it's interesting to see that in your biography.
Yeah, I agree.
And well, focusing now on more on digitalization in Thailand, I wanted to ask you, like, how is the Bank of Thailand embracing digitalization? Is there, for example, any particular initiative that you would like to remark, any area?
Yeah, sure. I can talk a little bit about that. In terms of embracing digitalization, I think the Bank of Thailand has done quite a good job on this front, even though we're a small country. So for most Thai people, electric payments are already a very essential part of everyday life. And, you know, the pandemic over the past couple of years has really driven this point home. It's become the new normal. And the backbone that's pretty much supporting all of these electronic payments in Thailand is called PromptPay. So that's our fast retail payment service. So pretty much anyone with PromptPay can conduct instantaneous peer-to-peer transfers to anyone else in Thailand, as long as they have the other person's phone number or their national identification number. And you can also use PromptPay to pay merchants by just scanning a QR code with your phone. I guess just to give an example of how popular it is, at the end of last year in 2021, I believe 68 million IDs were registered on PromptPay, and this is from a total population of 70-something million people. So pretty much everybody is using PromptPay right now. And most recently, we've also linked up PromptPay to Singapore's equivalent fast payment system, which is called Pay Now. And we're also looking to expand this network even more within Asia in the future. But I guess, you know, that being said, I think the e-payment space changes very fast, and we're starting to see new forms of digital money emerge. You know, we're starting to see cryptocurrencies and stable coins. You know, these coins that use blockchain, and they typically bypass the need for financial intermediaries, right? So the Bank of Thailand noticed this development quite early on. And in 2018, that was when we started to do work with the private sector on CBDC in terms of research and development. And so this is what my team, the digital currency team at the Bank of Thailand, does. So that this is one of our key initiatives that we're focusing on right now. And we strongly believe that, you know, CBDC being a form of technology-enabled money, we think that it has the power to pretty much change the future financial landscape. It's different from PromptPay in the sense that, you know, it could serve as a new financial infrastructure that's open to not only banks, but also non-bank participants. And they could help really sort of drive and build diverse and innovative financial services using CBDC.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you mentioned many interesting areas now. You mentioned the fact that, well, Thai people are very used to making electronic payments, which is something very interesting to see, because it's not like that everywhere. I mean, I've noticed that it's quite common in Southeast Asia, but not so common in other areas. So it's interesting to notice that, because, I mean, the more a population is used to making electronic payments, the more, well, or the less complicated, the easier it's going to become for that same population to embrace, let's say, for example, CBDC in the future, etc. And aside from that, you also mentioned two key ideas, two key topics that we're going to discuss now in much more detail, which are CBDCs, of course, and then cryptocurrencies. So I am going to start with CBDCs. Well, you mentioned a bit now this, but still, I mean, I would like to focus more on the two projects that, as long as I'm aware of, the Bank of Thailand is working on, which are the retail CBDC pilot project in Thailand, as well as mCBDC bridge. And starting for the very first one, the retail one, could you please share with us what's the current status of these retail CBDC tests, which, if I'm not mistaken, are about to start in Thailand?
Yeah, sure. Of course. So that's absolutely right. We are planning to launch a small scale pilot test of our retail CBDC later on this year, so most likely in the fourth quarter. And last year, we finished developing a proof of concept of our retail CBDC. And right now we're in the middle of talking to banks and non-bank participants who will act as the intermediaries during our pilot test, since we're planning on adopting a two-tier distribution model. So they will be the ones doing all the customer facing activities in terms of, opening the wallet for users. And once we've selected these participants, we'll work with them to prepare for the pilot, which is at the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. And this project, what will it evaluate? Will it, for example, evaluate whether it is feasible to launch this CBDC, or will there be like any other aspect that you will take into consideration?
Yeah. So the main purpose is to pretty much do that, to evaluate the feasibility and the functionality of the CBDC itself, to check whether it can be used as a means of payment and settlement for everyday real life purchases of goods and services. Another thing we hope to be able to evaluate during the pilot test is we hope to be able to get user feedback as well on the overall user experience of, from opening the wallet to paying with CBDC. But given that the pilot might be it's still a small scale pilot, we may not be able to get as much in-depth data on consumer behavior as we'd like. But that's something we hope to gain more in future iterations.
No, I mean, it makes sense, because as I always say when I'm teaching about this topic, for example, actually testing a CBDC takes time, because CBDCs affect the very core of a country's monetary policy, financial stability. So that's why you cannot expect any country to come up with a CBDC, let's say in half a year or 1 year. No, it takes years to test, to design it properly. But still, I mean, it's good to see that you are working on this area as well.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, like, overall, what would you say would be like the main advantages for Thailand to have its own CBDC, if it eventually does? Because you mentioned before that people in Thailand are already very reliant upon the idea of making electronic payments. So what extra would this CBDC bring to Thai people if eventually launched?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's one that we get asked very, very often, from the industry, from reporters, from news channels, and from people following these news channels, following our work. So, the question is, why do Thai people need a CBDC? And I guess the more direct question that we've gotten is, why does Thailand need a CBDC at all when we already have PromptPay, the fast retail payment service system that I introduced earlier? And I alluded to this answer earlier when I was talking about PromptPay, but I'll just say it again. It's that CBDC would not serve only as a digital form of central bank money, but it would also serve as the financial infrastructure that is open and inclusive of banks and non-banks. And this is where PromptPay currently falls short, because it's only limited to users with bank accounts at the moment. And on top of that, CBDC is programmable, meaning that you can put conditions on it and it can be used with smart contracts. So I think the potential to build really innovative use cases and diverse financial services with CBDC is quite exciting. And that's where I think the real opportunity lies for Thailand.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I agree. I concur. The idea of CBDCs being programmable money makes this whole area much more exciting. I fully agree. And I know that you haven't started those tests yet, so it's quite difficult for you to foresee any risk or challenge. But is there like in advance any risk or challenge when it comes to this retail CBDC that you are taking into consideration, or that you are expecting to see or materialize in the future, like in general?
Yeah, sure. There will, with any new product or with any new service, there will definitely be risks and challenges involved, without a doubt. Some of the more common risks that people tend to talk about when it comes to retail CBDC is that they're always concerned that CBDC, it would disintermediate banks, or CBDC could cause bank runs in times of distress. But personally, I think most, if not all of these risks can be mitigated through the design of the CBDC itself. So for one, most central banks, including the Bank of Thailand, we're planning to use a two-tier distribution model, and we're not planning to pay any interest on the CBDC. So this is so that we can preserve the role of banks within the financial system, and not have CBDC compete with bank deposits, because that would ultimately affect the bank's cost of funding and also the lending cost to consumers. And it's also possible to set limits or thresholds on the transaction amount or on withdrawal amount, so that people don't convert all their CBDC, or sorry, all their bank deposits to CBDC whenever there's a panicky situation. And these limits can also serve to prevent money laundering and other illicit activities as well. You know, there's always the risk of that, but it is preventable. So I guess those are the risks that people most often talk about. And yes, they are able to be mitigated through the design itself, but then there's a whole another category of challenges, I would say, that we really need to think about. And I think for Thailand, the biggest challenge might be adoption itself, even though Thailand is a country that is very advanced in terms of adopting digital payments. But given that there are a lot of digital payments and e-money services on the market already, how we're going to have to really think about, you know, how we can convince the user or the average Thai person to adopt yet another form of digital payment. So, you know, adoption of the CBDC, it'll only happen if the users are receptive of it, right? And they need to be able to understand what it is that they're holding on to and transacting with. So I do think there will need to be a certain level of digital financial literacy, but we're trying to design the CBDC to be as accessible as possible by all population groups. So, you know, even the elderly or even those living in rural areas will be able to use it quite easily. And at the same time, we're also really sort of pushing mass educational campaigns to spread awareness on CBDC. Just educating people on what it is, what its benefits are, and what potential use cases they can expect to see from it when it goes live.
Well, I think you made reference to some very interesting ideas. The first one, for example, the idea that you can mitigate risks through the specific design of the CBDC. And I think that's a very important idea that I keep repeating when I teach, for example, my courses at CFT in London, CBDCs. I devote one chapter, one of my course to risks and challenges. And in that part, I always say that as well, because, well, some people are worried about certain features of CBDCs, but the thing is, the right technology exists to prevent those risks from materializing. No? So all you need to do is to make sure that you design your CBDC accordingly so that doesn't happen. I say that when it comes to privacy, for example. You said that when it comes to preventing bank runs, and I think it's a very important idea. No? This idea of making sure that through design, through the actual or accurate design, you are mitigating those possible risks, because CBDCs, of course, are not completely riskless. There are risks and challenges, but they can be easily prevented as long as you know how to design it efficiently. And then on a second level, I think this idea of adoption that you mentioned as well is very interesting. It's not enough to make sure that your country has an actual use case, to design your CBDC correctly. You also need people to start using it. And the best way for people to use it is what you said, to educate people, to make sure that they are aware of what that product is and how it can be beneficial for them. And you made a very interesting remark. You talked about making sure that people, even in rural areas, for example, get to understand your product completely. And I think it's very important because, as we said before, when it comes to CBDCs, the idea of promoting financial inclusion through CBDCs is, to me, one of the key areas of this whole idea. So if we, for example, were to create a product that is only used in urban areas, but not in rural areas, I think we would be missing like a very important part or chunk of a CBDC like benefits. So this is why I think that that your approach is actually very accurate.
Yes, yes.
And well, moving forward, we talk now about this retail CBDC project, but the Bank of Thailand is also working on another project, which is called mCBDC project. This is a project which I actually discussed in some of my previous episodes as well with some people from Hong Kong. And this is because the Bank of Thailand is not working alone in this project. It's working alongside the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, HKMA, which is Hong Kong de facto's central bank. Also alongside the Digital Currency Institute of the People's Bank of China, as well as the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates. Could you please let our listeners know a bit more about mCBDC, like what's this project and how was the Bank of Thailand involved in it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess just to be clear for all listeners that everything that we've been talking about up to this point was actually on retail CBDC, which is CBDC that's going to be used by the general public. But actually, just wanted to say that the Bank of Thailand actually started doing work on wholesale CBDC long before we even started looking into resale CBDC, and this was back in 2018. This was when we initiated Project Tunyathon, and the focus of the project was pretty much to look into how blockchain or distributed ledger technology could be used to improve the domestic payment system. And then moving forward, we decided to sort of extend this project further and join hands with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority to do Project Tunyathon Lion Rock. And this was where we developed a cross-border corridor network where fund transfers between Thai banks and Hong Kong banks could pretty much occur instantaneously on a peer-to-peer basis. So what this does is it eliminates the need for correspondent banks altogether, and it lowers the costs of transactions significantly, and it also cuts down on transaction time by a lot. So I think the average transaction time for any transaction within the Asian region is around 3 to 5 business days. And with our prototype that we developed with the HKMA, we were able to reduce the transaction time just to a mere 2 to 10 seconds. So that was what we did. And then last year, it just so happened that the Digital Currency Institute of the People's Bank of China and the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates, they decided to join our cross-border project as well. And so we renamed the project from Tunyathon Lion Rock to the Multiple CBDC Bridge Project instead, or mBridge for short, like you said. And the project is now under the support and guidance of the BIS Innovation Hub in Hong Kong. So between the 4 central banks and the BIS Innovation Hub, I would say the project is still in the early stages, but what we're pretty much doing is we're pretty much seeing if we can use the findings that we learned in Tunyathon Lion Rock and see how we can scale up the prototype from there to support 2 additional jurisdictions and therefore 2 additional currencies. So our goal is to still work together to alleviate the pain points in cross-border payments, but also by experimenting under more realistic conditions with more business use cases that spanned over more countries involved.
I think it's a very interesting project indeed, because, as you said, it involves several countries, and also because of this idea of being wholesale. So I wanted to ask you, like, what's next for mCBDC Bridge? Because you said that you are still in an early stage. So what are the next steps? You mentioned now the idea of adding additional jurisdictions. Is there anything else that you want to focus right now?
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of things we need to do this year. So the first thing that we probably need to do is we really have to think about how, given that there are so many countries involved, there are 4 countries involved, and each country has its own set of rules and regulations and procedures when it comes to transacting cross-border payments. We'll really need to think about how we can automate and embed a lot of these jurisdiction-specific requirements into the prototype and the platform itself. And we also need to keep in mind that, whatever we build and design, that it wouldn't negatively impact, any country's ability to conduct monetary policy, or it doesn't compromise their ability to ensure financial stability. So we need to think about, whether or not we need to place limits on how much foreign CBDC can be held by banks within our jurisdiction, or if we need to place limits on how much how much of our jurisdiction CBDC can be held by foreign banks. So these are the things that we need to think about this year. And we also definitely need to think about how to establish some sort of governance structure, given that there are 4 countries involved. There will be banks from these 4 countries involved. So we need to think about what are the criteria to onboard them into the system. And going forward, we'll also think about whether or not we want to expand this network to include non-bank players as well, such as payment service providers or even large corporates, since they also do a lot of cross-border transactions.
Well, thank you for sharing. That sounds fantastic, and we are definitely going to keep track of the latest news of this very interesting project, because I mean it's always good now to see this project moving forward. Because to be honest, I started to follow it even before it was rebranded as mCBDC, when it was just Intanon Lion Rock, and it involved Hong Kong and Thailand. So seeing it evolve so quickly and so interestingly is something remarkable.
Thank you.
And well, just 2 more ideas before wrapping up. The first one is that we talked before about designing a CBDC to make sure that that we mitigate risks, and so forth and so on. Now I wanted to ask you a bit about the technology. As you know, of course, CBDCs may or may not use blockchain technology. It's a choice from its central bank. In some cases, a blockchain can be used only partially. So do you think that CBDCs should in general use blockchain, or what's your view on this part?
Well, I think it really depends on what sort of CBDC you're talking about. And, it also depends on the context of that country, because it is widely known that blockchain has its limitations in terms of performance and scalability, meaning that it's not able to support a nationwide level of retail payment transactions just yet, especially if you're looking at a country with a huge population such as China. So in that case, maybe blockchain for retail CBDC wouldn't be the most optimal technology choice. But for wholesale transactions, blockchain, it seems to work just fine, given that wholesale transactions are typically larger in value, but they're smaller in volume. But then there's also the additional element to think about, which is the trade-off between transaction privacy and scalability, because when you have a decentralized network that runs on blockchain, it's intended to be transparent, right? So if you impose more privacy settings onto the network, transaction processing times will increase, and the network therefore becomes more difficult to scale. So I think central banks, including the Bank of Thailand, this is something that they will need to think about. They need to evaluate these trade-offs in deciding what technology they will choose to adopt at the end of the day, given that they will probably want to have some level of visibility into the transactions that are happening.
Indeed, I agree. I think it's going to be depending on a case-by-case basis, rather than something that allows us to make any general statement, because it's going to depend pretty much on each country's needs and special situations. And now that I mentioned blockchain, I wanted to talk about cryptocurrencies, because, well, as I always say, and many people say that as well, CBDCs are not cryptocurrencies because of many reasons. One, of course, and this one is very obvious, because CBDCs are going to be issued by a central bank, like this case, for example, the Bank of Thailand, if you finally issue it, whereas cryptocurrencies are, of course, as decentralized as anything can be, because they are the flagship of this DeFi movement. So I wanted to ask you if you could please share with our listeners what's the Bank of Thailand's view on cryptocurrencies?
Sure, sure. Yeah, this is also another question we get
I
really
can
often
imagine.
at the central bank. And you are right. A lot of people think that a CBDC is a cryptocurrency. And so every day we'll have people, sort of trolling our Facebook page and saying that, like the digital bot, it's never going to live up to the Bitcoin. No one will ever want to hold it.
Yeah, it's such a
But that's
different
the
idea.
thing, right? Like, exactly, that's the thing. It's not meant to compete with Bitcoin. It is meant to compete with the banknotes that are in your wallet and the
Exactly.
banknotes that you use to pay for everyday goods and services. But you're right. Cryptocurrencies are a very big area of interest right now, especially among younger population groups here in Thailand. So from a central bank perspective, we want to make sure that people who are in this crypto space are full of the risks off some sort of protection. I think the general viewpoint from the Bank of Thailand is that we are okay with investing in crypto as an investment, but we do not want to see cryptocurrencies or any digital assets really becoming used as a means of payment for goods and services. This is because we think that, one, they're too volatile. Two, there's always the risk of cyber theft or personal data leakage. And three, they could be used for money laundering and other illicit activities. So all of these factors combined, they do not lead to cryptocurrency, as a good means of payment. And we also think that if this were to ever happen one day, the widespread adoption of digital assets as a means of payment, it could lead to fragmentation within the payment system. And this will probably erase a lot of efficiency gains and drive up the costs for users. And so if it's left unregulated, I think the roles of central banks, the role of banks would probably be significantly eroded. And monetary policy, liquidity provision, exchange rate stabilization, these things will also probably go out the window, which is why we are constantly monitoring developments within this space. And I think our view is pretty much consistent with other regulators, though. So I think the Fed, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, central banks in Europe, we all tend to share this view that cryptocurrencies really shouldn't be used as a means of payment.
Yes, I agree. I think your view is consistent and similar to the one from those central banks that you mentioned. And I mean, I personally think that even though many friends who are crypto enthusiasts do not agree with me, I think that cryptocurrencies, of course, have a huge potential when it comes as an investment asset class. There is no doubt of that. I mean, as you can, they are very volatile, but of course they can be a very rewarding investment. But when it comes to cryptos as a means of payment, of course there is a potential in that area. But I think as well that, at least to me, I don't see cryptos replacing like the existing actual means of payment. No, because the fact of not being centralized to an extent makes them, I know, to some people interesting, but at the same time risky. No, I mean risky because I mean when it comes to the issuance, to AML, no, because of many reasons. So that's why, for example, when El Salvador introduced last year Bitcoin as a legal tender, well, I mean, I'm not going to say worried, but I was a bit shocked because I don't see Bitcoin or any other crypto like the right tool for a country as a legal tender. No, I think there is a potential. I mean, I don't say that crypto should be banned or anything like that. I think they can coexist perfectly with CBDCs, with virtual banking. No, I think they should be part of this future of money ecosystem, to put it this way. But I think that I don't know, making them become legal tender is definitely too much. And I don't think that actually this is what people who created cryptos wanted cryptos to become in the end either. So I think that your approach, well, at least to me, seems consistent.
Okay, yeah, that's good to hear.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Teo. We need to wrap up this discussion. We've been discussing for over half an hour digitalization in Thailand, payments in Thailand, no CBDCs. We started with retail CBDC projects that are about to start this year in your country in Thailand, and we talked about mCBDC, cryptocurrencies. So we tried to cover many different topics and ideas in shortly more than half an hour. So for that, I would like to thank you, and of course, thank you very much for accepting my invitation. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much again for having me. And I hope that this was useful for your listeners. And yeah, I'm honored to be able to share the Bank of Thailand's experience on CBDC.
Definitely, it's going to be very useful. I'm sure of that. I try to talk to people from as many countries as possible, and Thailand, of course, needed to be on my on my list, because I mean it's a very interesting and important country who's very active on these CBDC areas. So, well, thanks again, and to all my listeners, thank you very much for listening to this episode. Please stay tuned for the next ones. We are going to have more people from central banks and from fintech companies and from the industry in general in the coming episodes. So thank you, and please stay tuned for the next episodes. Goodbye.
Thank you.